thank you for that kind introduction. I think we should all get introduced by Aaron. I really feel like well, I'm delighted to be with you this morning. I was able to have a webinar with some folks from AUM a few years ago, and I'm really happy to be with you finally in person. So thank you, Aaron and Lynn, for bringing me here. This should be a fun time. Well, as you know, I'm a philosopher, and that means that the first thing I've got to do is either make you think about death or state my main thesis. I think for a morning session, probably stating my main thesis will be the better way to go. So what I want to suggest today is that colleges and universities should take as one of their main aims educating for intellectual virtues. And so what we'll do today is try to unpack that sort of in terms of the what, right? What are intellectual virtues? The why should we educate them? And then we'll spend a little bit of time on the how, right? How might we educate for these virtues? Okay, so start with the what. So what are intellectual virtues? A good kind of initial definition or account is something like this. Intellectual virtues are the character traits of an excellent thinker. The character traits of an excellent thinker. Now that gives us something, but maybe not as much as we want. After all, this doesn't quite tell us what makes intellectual virtues different from other things. So we're going to try to make progress beyond this little account. Maybe a first way to do that would be to look at a list of intellectual virtues, right? So there's no official list of intellectual virtues, by the way, but here are some of the important ones. Curiosity, intellectual carefulness, intellectual autonomy, right? Thinking for ourselves, intellectual humility and self-confidence, intellectual honesty, fair-mindedness, open-mindedness, and so on, right? So you're probably familiar with lots of these terms, and so this gets us kind of into the territory, what intellectual virtues are. But my favorite way to talk about intellectual virtues is to tell stories, right? To give some examples of what intellectual virtues look like in action. So I'll give 3 examples. These examples will all center on virtues such as perseverance and courage, but what we'll see is that these virtues, though similar, play different roles in different situations. So intellectual virtues are relevant to our getting knowledge, and then also to our keeping the knowledge we have, and then to our sharing or disseminating it. So let's start with an important case in which someone exercises intellectual perseverance in getting knowledge, right? In getting knowledge. So this is my friend Charlie Lasseter. I've known Charlie for about 10 years. He's a professor at Endowed University, which is just down the road from me in Spokane. Charlie is a tenured associate professor of philosophy. Well, up until about 2 weeks ago, I had thought for these last 10 years that Charlie and I had pretty similar stories, right? You go to your undergrad, you go to grad school, right? You sort of slog through the rigors of 5 or 6 years in grad school, and then you get a job. Well, what I found out a couple of weeks ago when I read a philosophy website called The Workbench. You should all look at this website by Nathan Ballantyne puts it together. It's called The Philosopher's Workbench. If you just Google philosophy workbench, you'll find this. Nathan interviewed Charlie to talk about Charlie's experiences growing up and as a grad student. And as I read this, I found Charlie's experiences were vastly different from mine. Charlie grew up in an abusive home. Charlie suffered from depression and borderline personality disorder, really a tough childhood and kind of early young adult life. As he entered college, and in college, he encountered the philosophical works of William James. James is an American philosopher, known among other things for developing a kind of philosophical optimism. And so as Charlie read William James, he started to get the thought, oh, maybe my life could be better. And he started to really get into philosophy. Decided he wanted to do a PhD. And this is where he encounters more obstacles. So he's admitted to a good PhD program, but admitted without funding. Right? You've all done PhDs, you know what that means. Right? Graduate school is expensive, it's hard to pay for, and so if you have to pay for it yourself, that's really difficult. But Charlie really wants this education, so what does he do? He decides to line up gigs as an adjunct professor, teaching a full load alongside his graduate studies for much of graduate school. And so, as he tells these stories, about what it's like, writing his dissertation while teaching a full load. He gives these little accounts of writing his dissertation in these little 15-minute increments, right? He's standing at the line in the grocery store at 2 a.m., right? Working on his dissertation in these spare moments. In the subway or on the train, on the bus, finding little spare moments to read an article or write part of a paragraph, leaving himself these little scraps of paper to tell him where he left off. He sleeps on the floor of his office, right? Waits for the janitor to leave and then clicks off the light, goes to sleep. By the time Charlie got a tenure-track job, he had taught some 50 sections of various courses in philosophy. Now, that's as many courses as many of us teach in the first 8 or 10 years of our career. Here he's doing it while a full-time graduate student. This is, I think, a remarkable account of intellectual perseverance in action. Right? Charlie wants this education, and he does what it takes to get it. Here's another account of intellectual perseverance in action. This is perseverance in action, not so much for getting knowledge, but for keeping it. Right? We not only want to get knowledge, we want to keep it. So I'll try not to spoil this for you if you haven't read it, but this novel, Fahrenheit 451, the author, Ray Bradbury, talks to us about this main protagonist called Guy Montag. And Montag is a fireman, but the dystopia of the story makes his job a little different from that of a fireman in our world. So Montag's job is not to put out fires, but to start them. And his main targets are books and the people who own them. Right? It's illegal to own books in this dystopian world. Well, Montag discovers a book while on duty one day. He gets curious about it. He starts to think, maybe this is really valuable. And so to make a long story short, he holds on to the book, he gets in trouble, and he finds himself on the run. And while on the run, he comes across a group of intellectual nomads, a group of people who decided what we need to do is memorize the books of the past so that later we can put them down into writing and keep this knowledge that we hold dear. So I'll just read to you a passage. So Montag comes across these nomads, and he's talking to one of them who says this: all we want to do is keep the knowledge we think we will need intact and safe. We'll pass the books on to our children by word of mouth, and let our children wait in turn for the other people. And when the war's over, someday, some year, the books can be written again. The people will be called in, one by one, to recite what they know, and we'll set it up in type until another dark age, when you might have to do the whole damn thing over again. But that's the wonderful thing about humans. They never become discouraged or so disgusted that they give up doing it all over again, because they know very well it is important and worth doing. Memorizing these great books, line by line, to keep the knowledge they think they'll need intact and safe. That's intellectual perseverance in keeping knowledge. Right? If you've ever tried to memorize anything, memorizing a whole book would be quite a task. What about perseverance and courage in disseminating knowledge and sharing? I'm a little sheepish to talk about, the real Dr. King in this room, but I can't help myself. Right? So think about his story through the lens of intellectual virtues. Intellectual perseverance is the virtue that we need to overcome obstacles to our getting, keeping, and sharing knowledge. And in this case, Dr. King's obstacles come as he's sharing the knowledge. Right? So think about these obstacles. People who just won't listen to him. Corrupt politicians. Right? People who lie about him. Right? He's doing all he can to get this important message, right? The truth of human value, the truths of the civil rights movements across to people who just won't listen. Or think about the intellectual courage that he displays alongside his moral courage as he conveys these important truths. Right? So intellectual courage is the virtue that we need to hold on to intellectual goods, to disseminate them, to get them in the face of fears or threats. So it's a kind of species of intellectual perseverance, only the obstacles are very particular ones, right? Fears and threats. Well, you know very well the threats that Dr. King faced, right? Threats to his very life, threats to his family, threats to his reputation, threats of arrest, right, and so on. This is intellectual courage in action, right? Alongside all the other things we want to say about Dr. King, among other things. He's an exemplar of intellectual courage in action. Okay, so with those accounts or narratives of intellectual virtues in place, I think we're now well positioned to unpack our earlier definition in a little more detail. So what we've just seen are intellectual traits of excellent thinkers in action. Now let's add a little more kind of structure to this. So this is the part where we kind of do a little bit of philosophy, right? So intellectual virtues are, first of all, excellences. They're not averages. They're not traits that everybody has. They're traits that kind of set people apart, right? They're intellectual excellences. Now, there are other intellectual excellences besides intellectual virtues. Excellent intellectual skills or abilities might count there, right? They might deserve the name excellent. Intellectual virtues are set apart from these because they're character traits. They're not just behaviors, they're not just abilities. They sort of speak to who we are on the inside. So as character traits, intellectual virtues dispose us to behave in certain ways in intellectual matters. But they're also about how we think, how we feel, and how we're motivated in relation to truth and knowledge. So think just for a moment about someone who's intellectually honest, maybe honest Abe Lincoln. Right? So sure, he's disposed to tell the truth, that's the action part. But he also has certain thoughts or beliefs about truth. He believes that truth is valuable. He believes that lying is bad. He believes that it's important to convey the truth, at least insofar as one can. He's also motivated to do those things. Right? He wants to tell the truth. He feels disdain when he thinks of liars. He feels regret when he thinks of telling an inadvertent falsehood. Right? This is how he feels about knowledge and truth and understanding. So intellectual virtues speak to who we are on the inside in relation to these important goods, right? Intellectual goods of truth and knowledge and understanding. They motivate us toward truth, knowledge, and understanding, and away from kind of the intellectual bad things like falsehood and ignorance and confusion. Intellectual virtues often exist as means between extremes. So and here, people who work on intellectual virtues often model them on moral virtues in the same way Aristotle does. So if a chart like this looks familiar to you, that's not by accident. So intellectual virtues often stand as a mean between extremes. There'll be an extreme of deficiency on the one hand, and an extreme of excess on the other. So you might think, for instance, of curiosity. That stands between indifference, right? This student who says, what's going on in class today? I don't know, and I don't care, right? That on the one hand, and then on the other hand, this person who's just sort of up on all the latest celebrity gossip, right? Seeking knowledge that's not valuable, seeking knowledge that's none of their business, and so on. That's a kind of intellectual gluttony, right? They're filling themselves up with intellectual sweets that really aren't very healthy. Or you might think of intellectual autonomy, this virtue of thinking for ourselves. There's on the one hand, the student who's like, just tell me what to think, or just tell me what to think, and I'll do it. Or, just tell me what I need to do to get an A, right? There's that student. And then there's this other student who comes to my office once in a while, and talks to me for about an hour, and asks all this advice for what to do with the term paper, and then just totally ignores all the advice and writes the paper all by himself. Okay, so the virtue, autonomy, stands between those two vices. Right? Okay, this makes sense? Right. And notice that these intellectual virtues all concern a separate area of activity. That's going to come up again later, that'll be important. Okay, last kind of definitional point, these intellectual virtues are to some extent person-sensitive. That doesn't mean that kind of anything goes, but what it does mean is that an act that might take intellectual perseverance for your student, writing a 3-page paper, probably doesn't take that much intellectual perseverance for you. Or that the act of speaking up in class might take a great deal of intellectual courage for a student, but probably not much for you, right? You make your living doing this, after all. So there's some sensitivity to circumstance and ability and the like of those things when it comes to these virtues. This means that there's no single scale for excellence, but it also, right, we should add, you have to display genuine excellence to be intellectually virtuous. So that's a little bit about what intellectual virtues are. Now let's talk about why it might make sense to educate for them. So a good way into this is to just ask our students, or ask ourselves, why are we here? Why should anyone go to college? And as I talk to my students about this question, I get answers sometimes initially like this. Well, I'm here to meet friends. Everybody's longing for community, and this is a wonderful thing. College should be for this, at least in part. But there are, after all, cheaper ways to make friends, so maybe that's not the whole of it. Some students say, well, I'm here because ultimately I want to get a job. And that's vitally important. Right? Who among us would want our children or our students not to have a good job? Right? That's important. But in the AI age, and even before this, lots of jobs sort of either go out of fashion or completely cease to exist. We're told that our students will change careers more rapidly than we ever thought we would. So training for one specific job might not be the way to go. Maybe we want to train students for something broader. Maybe we want to train their minds in more general ways. Maybe we have to think about this not just in terms of finding friends or in terms of job preparation, but maybe we have to think about, well, what is an education? What's an education? So we might start by thinking of an education as something that trades in knowledge. Knowledge, after all, rhymes with college, so that's probably a good hint. But college graduates are supposed to be people who know things, right? Hopefully a lot of things, especially a lot of things in their subfield. But is knowledge enough for being a good thinker? Maybe not. First of all, I don't know about you, but I've forgotten a lot of what I learned in college. Began forgetting just as soon as final exams were over, right? So that's maybe not a good aim for the sort of the sole purpose of college. But notice also that people can use knowledge to unwise ends or even bad ends. So we want something more. There's something to guide knowledge in the right ways. Something to help people, connect bits of knowledge from over here to bits of knowledge over there, and so on. So then we might start to think, well, what about skills like critical thinking and reasoning, right? Logical reasoning of the sort that Aaron teaches? That's important, right? Vitally important. Who wants a society of graduates committing fallacies all over the place? This would be, or this is, a disaster. Right? But just as Aaron pointed out, someone could have good logical reasoning skills and not put these skills to use toward a good end. Right? They could try to show off, try to make other people feel stupid. Or, even worse, use their logical reasoning skills to manipulate others to get what they want. That's not befitting a good education. So, maybe what's missing, at least part of what's missing, are intellectual virtues. There's this nice book by Andrew Delbanco, College, What It Was, It Is, and Should Be. This came out, I don't know, maybe a dozen years ago. Really terrific read, inspiring, gives all kinds of great insight into the history of education and to our motives for educating. Delbanco recounts this story, right, kind of as he's working on the book, of this conversation he has with a colleague. Her name is Judith Shapiro. And as he's talking to her, she says, okay, here's what I tell my students. I say, you want the inside of your head to be an interesting place to live the rest of your life. I love that one. You want the inside of your head to be an interesting place to live the rest of your life. And as Delbanco begins to unpack this, what he says is, for the inside of your head to be an interesting place to live the rest of your life, your mind's going to have to take on certain characteristics. And so then he begins to list these. So first, he lists a skeptical discontent with the present, informed by a sense of the past. That sounds an awful lot like intellectual carefulness and intellectual humility, right? A sense of the past, realizing that we're not the only ones who know things, right? That our forebears know things that we should seek to know. Second, the ability to make connections among seemingly disparate phenomena. That sounds a lot like intellectual attentiveness. Third, appreciation for the natural world, enhanced by knowledge of science and the arts. That sure sounds like curiosity to me. Fourth, a willingness to imagine experience from perspectives other than one's own. Well, that sounds a lot like open-mindedness. So, one way to put this, Del says, is what we want our graduates to flourish. We want them to have minds of a certain sort, and as he unpacks this, it just starts to look like what he's saying is, though not quite in these words, we want our students to graduate with intellectual virtues. Okay, so that's a little bit on the why. We can talk more about that later. I think one thing we didn't mention was just the importance of intellectual virtue for civic life and for civil discourse, so maybe we'll return to that. That's another sort of element. But because this is an out-of-the-box teaching workshop, I thought what we could do is spend a little time on the how. So what I have here are kind of a series of strategies that will get our discussion started, and then we can sort of move on from there. Hopefully this results in some brainstorming that we can do together. So some strategies that I'll sort of work through. First, as we do this, we want to identify a set of kind of target virtues that we'll aim for our students to develop over the course of maybe 4 years, or maybe just over the period of a semester. Right? That big kind of wall of intellectual virtues that I had before, that's a pretty daunting place to start. We want to find a way to narrow that down. And then we'll work through some strategies that will help us once we've selected those virtues, right? Talking the talk, walking the walk, telling stories or narratives of virtues, and then giving students practice in thinking in virtuous ways, right? Giving them opportunities. So first, what do we do to identify some target virtues? Here what I suggest we do is start by thinking of maybe 2 or 3 virtues that are good answers to questions like these, right? So we ask, what do students need to succeed in my discipline? What do they need to succeed in my discipline? If I'm teaching engineering, maybe carefulness comes to mind. If I'm teaching political science and there's all kinds of discourse about controversial topics, maybe virtues like humility and open-mindedness will come to mind. We can also ask what students need given their backgrounds. Right? There's a difference between what a first-generation college student needs, probably some self-confidence, and what a student needs who's a 4th-generation college student who's been told their whole life, you're the smartest person in the room. That person might need to grow in humility. Right? So that's something that we can sort of ask ourselves. What does this particular student need? Or maybe, what do students at this university or in this class, right, what do they generally need? And then we can ask, well, what are my students' current capabilities? Students who struggle, to reason logically, right? Maybe carefulness is a central virtue to focus on there. Students who struggle to speak up in class might need to think of class time as an arena in which they develop intellectual courage. Right? So these are some different ways you might ask yourself questions to isolate a set of virtues that you'll then kind of make keystone virtues for a course of yours or something like that. Once we've isolated some virtues that we want students to develop, we can start doing the development. And the first thing here is to talk the talk. There's this philosopher Wittgenstein who says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. I think that's maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but there's something really helpful there. The ability to name something helps us to understand it in a way that we really couldn't before. I can remember writing my statement of teaching philosophy as a grad student who was finishing up, getting ready to go on the job market. And I was really struggling to find language for this until I came across the work of some philosophers who are working on intellectual virtues. And I thought, this is it, right? It's not just knowledge, it's not just critical thinking, it's wanting students to be excellent knowers as a matter of character. When I acquired that language from philosophers like Linda Zagzebski, and Robert Roberts, and Jay Wood, Heather Baddeley, among many others, that really changed the way I thought about education. And it can change the way our students think about their education. Right? This is an opportunity to grow in character, specifically intellectual character. Other ways we can talk the talk. We can incorporate intellectual virtues into our syllabus language. So This doesn't take long. We're talking about taking time to write just a couple of lines into a syllabus that say, hey, I want this class to be an opportunity for you to grow in courage or humility or carefulness or open-mindedness. We can take some time. This doesn't need to be a long thing, right? We did it just in 10 minutes here to introduce students to the language of intellectual virtues so that they can start seeing their educational experiences as opportunities for growth. We can locate specific intellectual virtues as related to our assignments. So as we assign a very difficult reading for students, we might encourage them, right? In the last 10 seconds before class ends, this is a difficult reading. Here's an opportunity for you to grow in carefulness or in perseverance as you stick through it on your second reading or something like that. Maybe that's a fantasy, your second reading, I don't know. Or students are getting ready to write term papers, right? These are opportunities to grow in autonomy, right? You're really going to think for yourself here. Philosophy is a long conversation, and it's your turn to talk, right? Or maybe for the students who were afraid to speak their own minds or to write their own views, this is an opportunity to grow in courage. They feel threatened by this. They feel like they're not going to have anything to say, or that what they say will be silly or something like that. Well, this is an opportunity to face that fear. Or think of an exercise where students are giving and receiving peer feedback. I've had students who are just terrified to give honest feedback to their friends. They're afraid their friends will be hurt if they say, you know what, you've got a comma splice here, or this sentence needs to be divided, or your argument's invalid, or whatever, right? Or have you thought of this objection? Students are just terrified to give feedback like this because they're afraid they'll hurt their friends' feelings. But as any of you know, to write well, we really need some friends who are willing to be honest with us. Well, an assignment like this can be an opportunity for our friends to grow in that virtue. It can be an opportunity for us to receive that feedback with courage, because it kind of hurts, right? And humility. On the back end, right, as we're handing back assignments to students, as we're grading, we can think about the way we use our feedback. So I don't know about you, but I find myself all too often writing these little, thin comments like "good job," right? "Well done." I mean, that's better than nothing. There's nothing worse than a student getting a paper back with just a number on it. But think about grading as an opportunity for virtue-centered feedback, right? So, hey, you showed a lot of courage in defending this controversial view. Or, you showed open-mindedness. I know you said in class you disagreed with this author, but you found a chance to learn from them. Or, this paragraph is good as far as it goes, but I think you can go deeper here. I'd like you to be a little more thorough. Right? I mean, do you see how that kind of feedback sort of, as we might put it, thickens the responses that we're giving to students? Helps them to see it in a way that's motivating. Oh, I really should be more thorough here, rather than just a line through the text or a more or something like this. Okay, another thing we need to do, in addition to talking the talk, is walk the walk. This can go badly really quickly, right? So, what we don't want to do is sort of walk into the class. All right, folks, I'm going to show you what intellectual humility looks like today, right? So we don't want to tell so much as we're trying to be examples of intellectual virtue. We want to show students what the intellectual virtues look like in action, right? So for a lot of us, this might just mean saying, I don't know the answer to that question, right, when a student asks. We need to shatter this image of professors as the people at the front of the room who are the sages who know everything, right? Saying, I don't know, gives a student permission to say, I don't know either, right? And then to pursue the truth together. We can ask questions in class, right? Even when we don't know the answers to them. I've never thought about that. I wonder, fill in the blank. We can show the virtue of carefulness in action by really slowing down a discussion and looking at the details. I remember this professor I had in graduate school would often assign his undergrads just a paragraph to read. for class. And he'd say, okay, I want you to read this paragraph, but I want you to read it 20 times. Right? And then in class, the professor would go through the paragraph with some painstaking way. Right? He's modeling carefulness there. Open-mindedness. Oh, I usually disagree with this author, but here's something great that they said. Another thing that students love is when we share our own projects and even our own failures. Right? This helps them to see that we're still in process, right? That we haven't arrived, that we don't have it all figured out, but that we're with them on this path of trying to grow in intellectual virtues. Right? So if we're willing to be vulnerable there, showing just a little bit of our fallibility and our finitude can be helpful. Probably the most important thing, though, I would say, is tell stories. There's nothing like narratives to convey the depth and richness and importance of intellectual virtues. So you'll all have people in your disciplines who exhibit these virtues that you want to discuss in class, right? This makes class richer, it makes it a more motivating space, it gives you a chance to talk about awesome people in your discipline, and it shows what intellectual virtues look like in action, right? So, just a few books. If you're in the sciences, there's this wonderful book by Rachel Swaby called Headstrong. This is about women succeeding in the sciences. It's just a series of short vignettes. John Grimmett, The Scientists, and then Hidden Figures by Margaret Shetterly. I'm sure you have examples in your own field, right? If you're in political science, if you're in economics, right? Whatever, you'll fill in the blanks yourself. But if we can find those stories of intellectual virtues in action, and maybe, this can be fun too, it can go dark, intellectual vices in action, and give students a picture of the kind of mind they want to have, and the kind of mind they don't want to have. Crucially, right, no matter how much we talk about intellectual virtues, no matter how much we model them, students will never acquire them unless we give them opportunities to practice intellectual virtues, right? Like last word, I'm talking about practice, right? Learning intellectual virtues is a lot like learning a skill, right? Including an athletic skill, and then it requires practice, it requires reps. Aristotle was onto this long before we traded, beards for mustaches. He says the things we have to learn before we do them, before we get into them, we learn by doing them, right? We learn by doing. Well, it's like that when it comes to acquiring virtues, including intellectual virtues. There's this wonderful book by Ron Richhart of Harvard School of Education called Intellectual Character, What It Is, Why It Matters, and How to Get It. And in this book, Richhart gives us a really good way to practice intellectual virtues in class, or to give students practice. And that's through a set of what he calls thinking routines. Thinking routines are just what they sound like. They're routines involving thinking that are easily repeated, that transfer across applications and subject matters, and that give students practice, right? So one routine that Richard develops that I really like is called the CSQ routine. C is for claim, S is for support, and Q is for question, right? So this is I would love it if every student had to take 2 logic courses during the university, right? But this is kind of what we can do as a stopgap in the meantime. Because what this is really teaching logic in a very simple way. Okay, someone's given an argument, or they've tried to defend a claim. What do? Well, we find the claim at issue, then we identify the support that's given for the claim, and then we start to ask questions about that support, right? Whether it's good support or not. All right, so here's just an example, right? Different cultures have different moral codes, so there's no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. Okay, what does that look like if we apply CSQ to it? Something probably like this, right? We've got the claim. That's number 2 there. There's no objective truth in morality, or maybe a slightly different way to put this. Right and wrong are just matters of opinion, right? That's the claim at issue. The support is this idea that different cultures have different moral codes. Okay, so we've done the C step, we've done the S step. Now we can start to ask questions. Right? Well, does that premise, if it's true, does it actually support that conclusion? Right? Or another way to ask the same question, are there other claims that are consistent with that premise, right? Well, maybe some cultures are just wrong when it comes to morality. Or maybe we can know some things when it comes to morality, but other things are hard to know. Right? Lots of different conclusions that we can draw that are consistent with that premise. That suggests that the support is not as strong as it should be, right? It suggests that there's a gap there that needs filling, right? And that can help us to see where the argument or where the discussion needs to go next, right? So CSQ, find the claim, find the support, ask questions. Rich Hart identifies lots of other thinking routines in this book. There's another book by Sherry Tishman and colleagues called Making Thinking Visible that provides additional routines. So if you're interested in this, just check out Harvard's Project Zero. That's where kind of all this coalesced. Rich Hart identifies this thinking routine called argue the other side. I bet some of you have done this in your classes, right? Okay, what you're going to do is pretend that you actually hold the opposite of what you believe, and you've got to argue for that. That can help us develop open-mindedness, right? Oh, I had to because my professor assigned me to be open to this other idea, and then, right, by having to argue for it, I found, oh, there's more to it than I thought, right? I was asked to consider the merits of an opposing view, and when I did, I found, well, there's some value here. Or as a routine that fosters humility, I used to think this, right, but now I think that. If I'm the kind of person who thinks the same thing at all times, probably I don't have much humility. Probably I haven't considered my views very carefully. If I've never changed my views in light of new evidence, that looks like it might be bad. Another routine, this is not one that Rich Hart identifies. I worry that this is going away with the rise of generative AI. But as we ask students to write term papers, multiple iterations, right? Revise the paper in light of the professor's feedback, in light of peer feedback, and then see how good it can be when you take extra time with it. This can foster perseverance, carefulness, thoroughness, and so on. So these are just examples. I would really encourage you to be creative as you think of ways to foster intellectual virtues. Probably the best thing to do is to look at your own syllabus, note the assignments that you already have on there, and then see which virtues you might already be teaching without knowing it. Right? That's a terrific way to get started. That's not daunting. Right? If we had to redo our entire pedagogy to educate for intellectual virtues, it probably never happened. Right? But we can do quite a bit with just a little effort, just by some reframing. Right? In the business school, they call this rebranding. Right? We can rebrand our education. Another way you can do this, so a lot of you I'm sure have read this book by Ken Bain, What the Best College Teachers Do. A few years ago, I just read this book and I started listing some practices that he recommended, and then just started thinking, well, what would I do if I wanted to educate for intellectual virtues with this assignment, right? How could I take, this revise and resubmit thing that I already had on my syllabus and label it as an opportunity for growth? Well, it looks like that would foster attentiveness. What if I had students help build the syllabus? That might foster their creativity and so on. So I really encourage you to just take some time with your syllabi and look at what you're already doing and see how that might lead you to educate for intellectual virtue. The last thing I'll say before we enter into a discussion time, I really encourage you to read this book by Jason Baer called Deep in Thought. Most of what I've learned about educating for intellectual virtues, I've learned from Jason, including in this book. If you read this book, you'll see a lot of overlap with what I've said here. That's because he influenced me. So this book it's thorough, it's readable, it gives you principles and then practices for educating for intellectual virtues. I really can't recommend it highly enough. I think I'll stop there, and then I think we've got, 15 minutes or so for discussion. Does that sound good?
I asked Lynn if I could run around with the microphone today. We're all fencing. So I'll open the floor for questions.
First off, thanks so much. I'm Josh. I'm from Arizona, so I'm a guest, but I was really intrigued by a lot of what you were sharing with us, essentially challenging us to rethink how we do what we do, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. But what struck me was a question about how we engage our students in this process, and how do we convince them that this is a valuable use of their time, given our current state of, I don't know, AI. This is a lot of work, what you're suggesting, not just for us, but for our students. How do we convince them that this pursuit is worth it?
Yeah, good. Well, so a couple of thoughts. So maybe the first thought or two would be just sort of general, and then something related to AI. So the first thought, right? So if we're thinking of intellectual virtues as the traits of an excellent thinker, one thing we might do is ask for a show of hands. But who wants to be a really lousy thinker? Like, what's the serious? Is there a serious alternative here? And if not, well, then it really just becomes a question whether students are willing to, to do the work. And there, I mean, I think most of them want to be good citizens. Hard to see how they're going to be good citizens if they don't have a certain amount of intellectual carefulness. Hard to see how they're going to be good at having discussions with others if they don't have open-mindedness and humility and so on. So maybe a way to do it is to show how intellectual virtues are linked to things that they already care about, rather than, okay, here's this new abstract thing that I'm going to tell you about intellectual virtues. Here's why you should care. Rather, here are some things you already care about. Now, well, it looks like you've got to have intellectual virtues in order to get those things. Loving relationships. We all care about loving relationships. I don't know about you, but some of my worst failures to love my family are failures of inattention. Right? Attentiveness would help me love my family better. Would help me be a better friend. When it comes to AI in particular, just one thought, and then I'd love to, if other people have thoughts, I'd love to hear them, because I really don't have my head around this. Okay, students are going to need to learn how to use AI, fine, but we have to think about opportunity costs. And if you have one set of students who decides, okay, I'm just going to outsource my thinking to AI, and then you have another set of students that says, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to become as good a thinker as I can, and then I'll use AI, when I need to. That second set of students, I'm going to bet in about 5 years, it's going to seem like they have superpowers compared to the first set. And that might not show in their term papers because, well, everybody can write a good one now. But I'm going to bet that it's going to show in the boardroom. So some initial thoughts. Right? Yeah.
So my question is a little related to what he just said, but it doesn't have to do with AI, but rather the sort of contemporary situation that we live in. Recently I read a book by Sarah Kendzior, in which she, last Road Trip in America, in which she described America as having this like horrific loss of empathy. And so, teaching courage, empathy, justice, these kinds of virtues, the intellectual as well as the civic virtues, I think is something that's important. But my question is, how do we do that in this environment without turning students off? Because, we live in the South, a lot of our students are from conservative families, and I've seen this reaction in the classroom. When you're talking about certain things, you can tell they start to grimace because they heard a different narrative at home, right? So I'm wondering how to gently weave this in, because I'm struggling with this, I teach history, so I'm struggling with how to weave this into my courses in a way that's not, I want it to be secretive, right? Because that's exactly what the right believes we do, right? Is that we're secretly brainwashing their children. But in fact, that is kind of what I want to do. Okay, I do want to introduce these ideas to their kids in a way, though, that's acceptable and and 100% legitimate, intellectually legitimate, right? Without the students automatically triggering and shutting it all down.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that this is much more difficult than it used to be. So I don't have any magic answer there. I mean, maybe some initial ideas, and I'd love to hear what you're doing. But one thing that might help would be to start with topics that are a little lower stakes if possible. Another thing that I've tried, I worry that students feel like they're tricked here, but I don't know what else to do, is to show them the mistakes that people on the other side are making, right? And then name that mistake and free the student to see whether people on their side might be making the same mistake. Now, we can't always just point that out, right? Oh, look at this, he's doing the same thing. But I wonder if we could, ask questions, right? Or ask maybe something as simple as this, well, does it matter who's making the mistake, right? Is this a mistake for one person but not for another, or is it a mistake across the board? Or maybe we just show them examples of intellectual vice in action on other topics, or on matters that have happened in the past, right? So that they can see what that looks like, and then hope that they notice some patterns. So that, we can't make them acquire intellectual virtues, and we can't undo a bad upbringing. One of the things Aristotle says we need to acquire virtues is a good upbringing, so we should all choose our parents carefully. But, as educators, we just have to do what we can. Anything that you've done in particular that you found useful?
Well, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find things that the students know less about, because then they're less invested in a particular point of view on it. So I'm in my world history class, I'm working on looking at genocides and the connections between hate and discrimination, and then ultimately killing people, and asking them to think about what virtues were missing in these particular events, on the part of the perpetrators, right? And so, for example, I was talking yesterday about this. I'm not going to touch Gaza, right? Or Israel, Gaza, right? That's because that one I think is students, even though they don't know much, really probably already have opinions on that. But when I'm talking about the Armenian genocide or the rape of non-king, they don't know that. And so I think they're better at thinking more objectively when it's these things in the past that they don't maybe have any opinions on. So I'm trying to sort of introduce the idea that way in my course. So
yeah, that seems really wise.
Hi, thank you so much. It really kind of made me brain start spinning on things. First off, are we going to get a copy of these slides by any chance?
Sure, I could send them out. Yeah, Lynn, if I could send them to you, then you can feel free to look at them or modify them or whatever. Yeah.
So I teach in the College of Business, and so getting an opportunity to do this. One of the thoughts you shared with us today was using virtue language and assignment feedback. I thought that was brilliant. Could you kind of go through the path that got you to start thinking about putting that in there? Because that thinking might help us find other ways, because we're teaching business class, especially what I do, is technical side of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's finding those ways, and I think it's so important to make that intellectual curiosity, and that's what I found is a lot of students just don't have intellectual curiosity. And if you don't have that, then it's really hard to get them going anywhere.
Right, yeah. Well, what got me thinking about the virtue-centered feedback was I just, read stuff by Jason Bear, and I thought, oh yeah, he's right, I should do that. So that was not much of a thought process for which I can take any credit, but Jason really helped me to see, oh yeah, I could be getting better feedback with this virtue language. So I teach a little bit in our business school at Whitworth as well, and have come to think that intellectual virtues are really important for managers. Right? When we think about, well, what does it take to be a good manager? Well, you need to do things like get the most out of your team and solve problems and resolve conflicts. And I think it turns out that virtues like open-mindedness and fair-mindedness and carefulness can really help with that. But you mentioned curiosity. How do we foster curiosity in business students? I bet that you do it just by expressing enthusiasm about your subject, right? Isn't this interesting, right? Isn't it interesting how markets work, right? Or isn't it interesting how the same lessons that we learn over here in philosophy can apply over here in business? I think of the Stoic philosophers like Epictetus saying things like, control what you can control, or focus on what you can control, and sort of do your best to ignore the rest. Expressing enthusiasm about those kinds of lessons and things that are far more technical than I can articulate here, that might be a really good way. Maybe another thing would be, there's this question I love. I don't remember where I get this. This might be from Ron Richard. What does this make you wonder? Or what are you wondering about right now? Maybe give students a couple of minutes to think about that and learn to ask those questions. So no single thing, but I bet you're already doing a lot of it just by expressing enthusiasm about the subject.
To the back.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you brought to the table this morning. It's been, as one of our colleagues has already said, just got our heads spinning about a lot of great ideas. I've been a public speaking instructor for quite a while and been working in the transition space, helping veterans transition into civilian careers. So in a lot of those cases, they have a plethora of skill sets and ideas, as many of our college freshmen do coming in to the college setting, because they're so worldly now, and TikTok, they can learn any and everything, except how to public speak. But having said that, I use values and action inventory and assessment as a character strengths, as a baseline, as they're preparing for their introductory speech to introduce themselves as a valuable team member to work with in the class. I just wanted to get your reaction about that tool and how you might be using it, or any concerns that you have with that tool.
Yeah, well, that's great. So I don't know the values in action tool very well. I wouldn't be able to speak to that. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's something I didn't talk about that can be a really valuable asset in the kind of intellectual virtues pedagogy toolkit are reflection exercises, asking students to think about where they stand with respect to certain intellectual virtues. Am I really curious? Am I really that careful? Am I really that thorough? In the back of Bear's book, Deep in Thought, he has a little inventory that students can take for themselves. And, psychologists are still working on developing validated measures for intellectual virtues. It's not like we have something that we just give to all students that's really far along, like the inventory you suggest. But as a reflection exercise, just thinking about, okay, what are the things that an intellectually virtuous person would do, and do I really do those things? Do I really think in those ways? That's gold as far as intellectual virtues education. One thing we want to emphasize is the path toward intellectual virtues education, or the path toward intellectual virtue, has to involve the student having a decent sense of where they are, and then they know where they want to get to, and then we start to think about how to get there. So those kinds of inventories are really valuable at that first stage. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
First, let me apologize for coming late, so you may have already answered this question. I was looking at one of the intellectual virtues, open-mindedness. How far do you go?
Excellent.
Are there any parameters on open-mindedness? Because in my mind, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, okay, you're looking at the storage bank, but the storage bank really is somewhat dependent upon your belief system.
Yeah.
And so everything kind of comes out of that. So how far do we go?
Yeah,
with
this is great.
open-mindedness?
Yeah, great question. Great question. So, open-mindedness is, it's a mean between, closed-mindedness, right? Dogmatism, right? Never listening to anybody, right? That on the one hand, and then a kind of indiscriminateness where we just listen to everybody, no matter what they say, right? No matter how silly it is, or even how dangerous or offensive it is. So there's nothing about open-mindedness that requires us to be open to ideas that are clearly false. One way to think of open-mindedness is as a kind of willing ability to take seriously the merits of other views, alternative views. Well, if the views don't have any merits, we don't have to take them seriously. So, there's a concern, as Bear puts it, that if we're too open-minded, our brains will fall out. But that's not real open-mindedness. That's not the virtue, right? That would be the vice of kind of being undiscerning or something like that. So what I suggest is trying to find that mean, between not listening to anything and listening to everything. And there's no special way to do that other than to consider the merits of the views carefully. But once we've seen that a view doesn't have merits, we don't have to be open to it.
I think that's a great place to end. Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you so